They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure could come in many forms, but it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. Our cursed treasure hunt begins in London, at a building that is not only itself associated with historical misery and misfortune, but which contains a treasure that is also linked to centuries and perhaps even millennia of greed and bloodshed.
The Koh-i-Noor diamond is one of the largest cut diamonds in the world. It's 1.5 inches long by 1.5 inches wide by 1/2 inch deep. For 150 years, it's been part of the collection of treasures which have been owned and worn by the British royal family. By tradition, it is only ever worn by female members of the royal family. And behind that tradition lies an ancient curse.
The Koh-i-Noor is one of the most renowned and sought-after treasures of all time. Throughout its history, it has been desired by emperors, monarchs, and supposedly even the gods.
The word Koh-i-Noor basically means mountain of light, which is what the Mughal rulers of India called it.
There was rumours of a great diamond written in the memoirs of Babur, who was the first Mughal emperor, about a diamond that was worth half the daily expense of the whole world.
It was even said that this mysterious stone was once the left eye of the Hindu goddess Bhadrakali.
It is a treasure, it is precious, it is revered by the gods.
However, the exact origins of the Koh-i-Noor remain a mystery, its existence only confirmed in the 17th century.
The diamond first appears in written records in 1628, when it formed part of the royal collection of the ruler of the Mughal Empire. Now, that was an empire which stretched across India to Pakistan and an extraordinary array of lands.
With such a large kingdom to rule, the Emperor Shah Jahan needed a suitably impressive symbol of his power.
It was a huge empire that had the most wonderful gems and jewellery, and in that there were the most magnificent items, and one of these was the peacock throne. This was the throne that the Mughal emperor would sit upon. It was made of solid gold and it was studded with the world's most finest gemstones, including pearls, rubies, emeralds and of course diamonds.
The Koh-i-Noor was the centerpiece of this throne, put in place in a decoration right at the top of the throne and commanding enormous respect.
The throne apparently cost more than the Taj Mahal, which is the other famous thing it's famous for.
But already it had a blood-soaked reputation, a spoil of war, snatched from amid the slaughter that accompanied so many battles for the Mughal throne. It would not be too long before Shah Jahan himself would be overthrown.
In the 18th century, the Asia area was a hotbed of warring factions, and it was at this time that Nadir Shah, who was the leader of Persia, invaded India.
Tens of thousands of people were slaughtered.
And through that invasion, he looted Delhi in 1739, and with that, he took many of the most famous jewels, the actual Mughal treasury, he removed and took them to Persia.
In fact, he carted away so much that it required, according to popular belief, thousands of horses and carriages and elephants simply to shift all the gold, silver, and above all, jewels that he looted.
From that moment, a succession of empires fought over the jewel, each one ending in violent disaster. And by 1845, it caught the attention of the indomitable British Empire.
It was during this time that India was having its own upheavals, and they asked some of the British forces to help them in some of the Sikh wars that were happening. So actually England supplied armies to India to help them fight these wars.
The Kohinoor diamond was owned by the Sikh royal family in Lahore, and this was essentially brought within British rule under control of someone called Lord Dalhousie. And one of the things in the Treaty of Lahore that brought that part under British control was that the stone, the Kohinoor, would be given, mind you, not seized, given to Britain.
But what about the curse that followed the jewel everywhere it went?
He who holds the diamond will rule the world, but only gods or women can do so safely. If a man owns, holds, or deals in the diamond, that man and all his deeds will be cursed, will suffer misfortune, death, and disaster.
Britain had the perfect solution: sidestep the curse by giving it to its female ruler, Queen Victoria.
When the Kohinoor first came to England, Queen Victoria loved the stone and she displayed it at the Great Exhibition of 1851. The trouble is, it didn't go down well with the public because it's huge, 186 carats, and it didn't shine like they expected it to, and the hype was built up so much that they expected something as big as the Crystal Palace itself where it was displayed.
But the royal family, Prince Albert particularly, thought it would inspire awe in those who saw it. In fact, it didn't. It was greeted as something of a disappointment. It looked, as the Times reported, just like an ordinary piece of glass.
And in fact, the satirical magazine Punch called it the Mountain of Dark, because it didn't really look that bright. So the Prince Consort, Prince Albert, decided to recut the stone. A couple of years after the exhibition, he had it recut. And it was recut into a modern, by that stage, modern, brilliant, oval, brilliant cut stone. It was seen as the sort of ultimate symbol, I suppose, of sort of rulership, control, power, and so on, which is why it became such an important political gesture when the British took it over.
Ultimately, it's now in the Queen Mother's crown, at the very centre, the most beautiful crown with the most beautiful diamond in the Maltese cross.
Over the last century and a half, it's been claimed back by Pakistan because Tulip Singh was from what is now Pakistan. It's been claimed back by India, who say it's really theirs. Iran has made a claim, and in 2000, even the Taliban made a claim for it because it had been briefly in Afghanistan. It's interesting, though, that in 2019, I believe the Supreme Court in India looked through all the evidence and decided that it was a gift given in good faith and that India had no claim to the stone.
This most recent twist in the story, the claim the stone was gifted to the British, came despite some damning evidence.
The way the stone passed into the ownership of the British royal family is one in which a young boy, a 10-year-old emperor, ruler, the last of his line, possessed both India and the stone, and the British forced him to sign over both his lands and the stone.
It's thought that the young emperor's mother was held prisoner until he signed away the priceless Kohinoor diamond.
It was called a treaty. The document which they made this young boy sign was called a treaty.
The controversial legacy of the Kohinoor diamond seems set to continue. But do experts really think it's cursed?
This whole idea of a curse is just sort of popularism and hogwash, frankly.
One of the things that's helped to perpetuate the myth and make it stronger is the fact that only female royals, even to this day, have ever worn that diamond. That seems to be reinforcing the idea that, yes, there really is a genuine curse here.
Today, 4 countries claim ownership of the Koh-i-Noor. But Britain remains obdurate. It's not going to hand the stone back. To me, that is the true curse of the Koh-i-Noor. It is a curse of modern British hubris in the face of legitimate claims by countries and governments whose treasures were taken by the British Empire.
A stone fit for a queen, but not for a king. There remains few gems as powerful or deadly as the Koh-i-Noor. The next stop in our hunt takes us to the City of Angels in the 1950s, where a fatal road trip extinguished one of Hollywood's brightest stars and became the first in a succession of accidents, bad luck, and tragedy to be associated with his car.
Few Hollywood superstars have as great and as long-lived a reputation as a cultural icon as James Dean. He began acting in 1950 at the age of 19, and after a series of walk-on parts in commercials and TV shows, he hit box office gold between 1953 and 1955 with 3 blockbuster movies: East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant.
Because of them and because of his aura, he became the very embodiment of emerging cultural trends, of the angry, sullen, dispossessed teenager constantly kicking at the world. And he adopted as his mantra the phrase, "Live fast, die young." A prophecy he seemed determined to fulfill with his love of motor racing.
People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track any day.
His first taste of speed was in 1955. At the Palm Springs road races in his Porsche 356 Super Speedster. And it was there that he saw Porsche's latest model, the 550 Spider.
The 550 Spider was a purpose-built race car. It was a 2-seater, mid-engined roadster with a 1.5-litre, 100 horsepower or thereabouts motor.
It was low-slung, made entirely of aluminium, and it offered almost no protection. Dean bought the car, which was christened Little Bastard.
Porsche only made 90 of them, so they were very rare, and at the time, they were really expensive.
Had the car actually survived in pristine condition, it would now be considered priceless. While showing off his new toy around LA, Dean bumped into the British actor Alec Guinness, who was immediately filled with a sense of foreboding and believed the car to be jinxed.
Guinness had a really bad feeling about it. He later wrote in his diary that he thought the car was sinister and that he pleaded with Dean not to drive it and felt that he would probably die within a week.
But the wild child actor dismissed the 41-year-old's concerns and prepared for his next race in Salinas, North California, with the help of his faithful mechanic, Rolf Wutherich.
On September 30th, 1955, Dean and Wutterich were headed to the Salinas sports car races, where Dean was going to try the car for the first time. Wutterich thought it was a good idea for Dean to drive there to get as much seat time as possible before the race. Just outside of Bakersfield, they got stopped for speeding.
But tragically, this didn't stop Dean with his devil-may-care attitude.
Dean was flying down Route 466 at an estimated 80 miles an hour when a young student called Donald Turnipseed turned right in front of him in his Ford Tudor.
And unfortunately, like a lot of young men, overestimated his ability and ended up going off the road. He wasn't trained, he didn't race as a professional racer.
There was a huge impact and Turnipseed's car was shunted at some 40 feet further down the road. Miraculously, Vutorich was thrown clear and survived.
The Porsche was wrecked and Dean was killed. The car was declared a total loss, a write-off, and it was taken away to a salvage yard. But it was bought by another racing driver, William Esrich, and he took the engine out of it and put it in his own racing car, a Lotus. He sold other parts to another racing driver, a friend of his called Troy McHenry.
Esrich and McHenry entered their cars into the Pomona races in 1956. Both cars crashed and McHenry was killed. And so began the curse of Little Bastard.
It seemed to be an indication that Little Bastard was a cursed car, something that would bring misery, destruction, and death to anyone who owned it.
The remaining parts of the car, which was basically 4 wheels and a mangled chassis, were bought by George Barris. He was a Hollywood car designer.
He had designed cars like the Monkeymobile and the original Batmobile, so he was very famous for his custom cars. Barris bought the wreckage and planned to restore it, but that's not actually what happened.
He sold off very quickly 2 of the tyres and donated the wrecked chassis to a travelling exhibition run by parts of the American government, which was meant to educate the public about the need to take care on the highway.
But ironically, it was the car itself that was a danger to the public. The car kept falling off its display. In one case, a bystander was badly injured. And on a second occasion, the driver transporting Little Bastard was killed when it fell on him. Once again, death and tragedy seemed to follow Little Bastard.
The myth of the cursed car of James Dean, a doomed sports car owned by a doomed actor, became part of the warp and weft of popular culture. And George Barris played up to that as something dangerous, something tragic, something cursed.
Who would want to go and see a car that had been involved in a crash? Nobody. But you say it was James Dean's, you say it was cursed, people start saying, "Ooh, let's have a quick look at it." And that's how the story goes. And then you sell it and sell it and sell it, and then people believe in a curse.
Even when it reached what was supposed to be the last stage of its journey, storage, the mangled chassis caught fire. And then, just as mysteriously, it disappeared entirely.
In 1960, Little Bastard was put in a sealed box on a train from Miami to Los Angeles, and somewhere en route it disappeared. Barris was ever the showman, and so there were rumors that he had just hid the car away and was planning to release it later on to great fanfare.
The only known surviving part of Little Bastard is its transaxle, an entirely unromantic and prosaic mechanism. It was found underneath the porch of a house in rural America in a crate where it had lain for years.
But can a car really be cursed?
The facts are undeniable. Death, injury, and misery does follow Little Bastard throughout its career from 1955 onwards.
His car was a beautiful car, well made, but beyond his driving skills. There's no curse to it. The curse is purely man-made to make money.
Do I believe the car was cursed? Well, the evidence stacks up. I'm not particularly superstitious myself, but I certainly wouldn't be installing that transaxle in my own car. Given its reputation, it's probably a good thing that little bastard is not still on the roads.
A life lived fast, cut cruelly short. Let this deadly car never ride the road ever again. Our hunt now takes us back in time to England's East Midlands in the 15th century, when a war violently ended one king's reign and destroyed not only his dynasty, but his legacy for centuries.
Few kings in the long and often inglorious history of the English monarchy have had such a bad press as Richard III.
King of England for just over 2 years, from 1483 to 1485. He's remembered more than 500 years later in various ways. Was he a Machiavellian monster who plotted his way to the throne, waded through blood to get there, perhaps killed his nephew? Or is that all just a myth?
Born in 1452, Richard was younger brother to King Edward IV of the House of York, whose bloody battles with the Lancastrians bitterly divided England in the second half of the 15th century.
Richard III lived during a period we now call the Wars of the Roses, or the Cousins' War. This was a conflict during the 15th century between the royal houses of York and Lancaster.
The Wars of the Roses, the brutal, bloody struggle for who would rule the kingdom, lasted 30 years. Those wars had an early and devastating effect on Richard's life. His father and his brother both died in them, and Richard was forced to flee.
He goes through these soaring highs of becoming a royal prince, moving up in the line of succession, and then being tossed aside, cast down, becoming a member of a family of traitors, dispossessed of everything. And this constant revolution really shapes his childhood and must have driven the man that he became.
His elder brother, Edward IV, died, and Edward's son, by royal tradition, should have gone on to take the throne. But the boy was only 12 years old.
Richard became Lord Protector to his nephew, Edward V, until he came of age to rule. But suspiciously, the royal heir and his younger brother, Richard, soon vanished, and Richard's position was elevated.
Under mysterious circumstances, Edward V and his brother disappeared from where they were being kept in the Tower of London, and then their uncle became king as Richard III.
It wasn't long before rumours started, before stories got about that they had been murdered, and the finger of blame was pointed very squarely at Richard III.
It will never be known if he killed his nephews, but their disappearance would haunt him. His short time as king was marred by constant uprising and revolts, culminating in a full-blown battle for survival.
The problem with Richard III is this, that actually as a king, he was pretty good. He handled justice well, council well, parliaments well. But he got the throne by taking it from his own nephews. And as a result, that unsettled the nation, gave him a lot of enemies, and they put up a rival contender to him.
Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, fighting against the forces of Henry Tudor, who had invaded his kingdom along with a contingent of disaffected English gentry and French military support.
The whole reason given by Henry Tudor for fighting Richard III was that he was an evil man who deposed and murdered his own nephews.
The death of Richard III is often used as one of those bookmarks in history, like 1066 and Hastings, 1485, and the Battle of Bosworth. His death does bring to a close 331 years of the Plantagenet dynasty, and it opens the doors to the Tudors.
The humiliation of Richard III commenced immediately after his death and would last for centuries.
His body is collected from the field. Later, we're told in sources it's stripped naked. This is important because Henry Tudor, who is now King Henry VII, wants everybody to be perfectly clear that Richard III is dead. He is not coming back. So the public display of body is about closing any suspicion that Richard might still be alive somewhere.
Henry Tudor was a king with no claim to the throne, so he had to present Richard as being an unworthy king, as a tyrant, so that he could present as being a better choice. The story about Richard had to change.
He was, in reality, one of the first victims of a concerted propaganda campaign, a series of public myth-makings which were propagated by his successors and their powerful supporters. And it established the idea that Richard had been cursed.
After Richard's death, we begin to get stories that paint him in a very dark light in terms of his appearance. And I think we always have to be aware that in the medieval mind, outward disabilities could be considered a sign of a corrupted soul. So these were the outward manifestations of evil from within in the medieval mind. A great example of this is John Rouse. He's a chronicler who had talked about Richard in life as being a wonderful king, a brilliant prince who was going to be the best thing England had ever seen. Almost as soon as Richard is dead, Rouse changes his account and he describes Richard as being retained in his mother's womb for 2 years, being born with a full set of sharp teeth and shoulder-length hair and fingernails, ready to bite and scratch at the world. And at one point he even describes Richard as ruling as the Antichrist would.
The portrait of Richard as a physically deformed, emotionally stunted monster was produced by Tudor historians, but it really went into popular imagination because of the play that William Shakespeare based on those historians.
He's described by Shakespeare as being hunchbacked, and he's given a withered arm, and he then has a limp. So these are all things to present Richard as outwardly and physically, bodily, conforming to the murderous, monstrous tyrant that Shakespeare's play has presented to us.
With his reputation as defiled as his body, Richard would lie lost and forgotten for over half a millennia, until a society was formed that sought to do him justice. But first, they had to find him.
The Richard III Society was established in 1924 by a small group of people who were interested in the story and the reputation of Richard III. It's developed and evolved from then and is now a worldwide organisation. But one of the elements of the story of Richard that was always missing is where are his remains?
He was said to have been buried in the church of the Greyfriars in Leicester. That building was then demolished in the 1540s following the dissolution of the monasteries. And the big question was what had actually happened to the king's skeleton.
But mysteriously, after hundreds of years, Richard sent a signal from the grave.
The story of how Richard's body was found is a modern epic, literally a cinematic one.
My involvement with the search for Richard III began in 2004 when I was in Leicester researching Richard III. And I went into some open-air car parks that were in the centre of Leicester, in what was then the old, large Greyfriars precinct. And in one of these car parks, in the northern end of this car park, I had what you can really describe as an intuitive experience, and it felt as though I was walking on Richard's grave. And beside me in that car park was a letter R on the tarmac, clearly for reserved parking. But as strange as it sounds, this was the catalyst that began my search for Richard III's grave.
When the dig started, it didn't look very promising, but amazingly, in the 6th hour, I think, of the first trench, some human bones were discovered, human leg bones. Now, at that time, It was no great surprise to find human remains because the friary would have a graveyard. The question is, whose bones were they?
But I think what was remarkable was that it was right beside the letter R. It was hugely exciting to find human remains right where I believed Richard III was buried. Then we had this most incredible storm, and suddenly this black cloud, and it really was a really black cloud, came right over the dig site. And so it was dark, and then the heavens opened and it was just downpour, and there was thunder and lightning, and it was almost like a Shakespearean scene. It was quite surreal, really quite surreal. And then slowly but surely they did uncover that it was a burial, and that it was the burial of a man who looked to be of the right age for Richard III, but also who seemed to have battle injuries and a spinal abnormality.
And that was the moment for me when I realised that against all odds, we'd been successful in looking for Richard. I think I may have uttered a few expletives and done a little dance. I didn't believe from the very beginning of the project that we would stand a chance of finding Richard III.
Finding medieval bodies in urban areas is kind of what we do all the time. They're extremely common. But to find the body of one of England's most celebrated or notorious kings underneath a car park, where the letter R actually marks the bay concerned and was the first letter of his name, is the kind of stuff of which legend is made.
With people questioning the legitimacy of the find, the team needed to prove conclusively that it was the body of the slain medieval king.
From the tests that were undertaken, they discovered that they were the remains of a young man who was in his 30s. Also that they were late medieval, which was the right time for when Richard III died.
One of the hopes of the project was that we would be able to extract ancient DNA from the bones we'd found on site. We were going to follow a type of DNA that runs down the female line. And there was an established family tree that goes right down to the present day. And we located 2 living members of that lineage. And so we could then test the DNA of those people and then compare it with the DNA from the ancient bones found on site. And that was where we got a match.
Through further analysis, the team were able to debunk many of the myths that surrounded Richard III, but also confirmed the brutality of his last moments and the lack of respect shown to him after his death.
All of the signs were that the grave that Richard had been put into was a rushed affair. It seemed to be too short for the body, so that he was hunched into the grave, but it was also quite shallow, so that his head was sitting higher than the rest of his body. So the suggestion is that the monks had to do this very quickly.
As an adolescent, he had scoliosis, which is a slight curvature of the spine, which would have resulted in one shoulder being higher than the other. This affliction didn't damp him down at all in physical activity, but it did give his enemies a propaganda advantage in representing him as a hunchback and with a withered arm. This is the picture of Richard that went down to posterity, and it's completely unjust.
His identity confirmed, King Richard III received a royal burial some 530 years after his death in a tomb in Leicester Cathedral. But can the damage inflicted over centuries ever truly be reversed?
One would hope that being given a proper ceremonial burial in a very eminent church and being mourned and surrounded at his reburial by supporters and admirers is the kind of fate which Richard would have wanted for himself in death. If that's the case, then his spirit should now at last be at peace.
Whether his reputation has been rehabilitated in the way that his remains have been put to peace is quite another story.
May His Majesty finally be at rest. But what other great figures from history may be found to lie in torment under the tarmac of a public car park? The final stop in our hunt takes us to ancient Syria, where a slab of stone was inscribed with an ominous curse that would wreak havoc centuries later.
In January 2017, the then Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in London received a legal writ. He and the force were being sued for malfeasance. Now, the Met was no stranger to being sued or to legal proceedings. What made this writ rather more unusual was that it referred to a 2,800-year-old stele, a slab of rock depicting a king of Assyria, and a slab of rock which contained a blood-curdling curse.
The Neo-Assyrian royal stele is a basalt monument that was dedicated to King Adad-nirari III. Now, he was an Assyrian king in the 8th century BC, and this monument was found in the ancient city of Dur-Katlimu in what is now Syria.
When we use the word stele, we are typically talking about an object made of stone, sometimes wood, on which inscriptions can be placed. So that's typically images of individual actors in a particular event, perhaps the king or an emperor, or perhaps gods, and an accompanying inscription, usually commemorating an event.
It was a man called Hormuzd Rassam who unearthed what became to be known as the Assyrian Royal Stele in May 1879, when he was excavating historical ruins on behalf of the British Museum.
The stele was discovered at a site called Tel Sheikh Hamad, which is in eastern Syria, modern-day eastern Syria, which in ancient times was a part of the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
It had been known about from Arab travellers, and it's believed that it had actually been tossed down a mound because it's considered to be idolatrous.
The stele was broken into fragments by the Muslims. For nearly 140 years, the top part of the stele lay in the British Museum, where successive scholars tried to decipher it.
The upper half of the royal stele depicts the head of King Adad-nirari III, and you can see some of the inscriptions, but certainly not all of them.
Part of the inscription of the stele is written in the cuneiform script, which was used to write the Akkadian language, the language of the Neo-Assyrians.
Because it was incomplete and only the top half of the inscription was visible, the experts were limited in what they could decipher. But then one of the scholars made a startling discovery. Someone online had published a remarkable archaeological find. It was the elusive bottom half.
In 2012, the owner of the lower half tried to sell that piece to the British Museum, and it was at that point that a woman by the name of Karen Radner, who was in the history department at University College London, was asked to examine it. She realised that this piece that she was examining belonged to the other half that was already in the British Museum.
With the two halves reunited for the first time in centuries, academics were at last able to translate the text, and they were in for a shock. Clearly written on the stele was a curse.
It was warning people to take great care of both the stele and his temple.
It's basically saying that the person, whoever removes the item or disturbs it in any way, may they be cursed.
Don't touch this, or you'll be in trouble.
Whomever discards this image from the presence of Salmanu and puts it into another place, whether he throws it into the water or covers it with earth, may the god Salmanu, the great lord, overthrow his sovereignty. May his name and his seed disappear from the land. There are no records of what fate might have befallen those who broke and cast down the Assyrian royal stele. But when it comes to events since the discovery of the bottom half, it's a very different story.
Although I don't believe in ancient curses myself, nonetheless, unfortunate circumstances have befallen people involved with it in modern times.
Before long, that bottom half of the stele turned up at auction. The major London auction house, Bonhams, put it up for sale on behalf of an anonymous owner, and they set the expected bid prices at somewhere between £600,000 and £800,000.
But a short while before the auction was due to take place, the Metropolitan Police raided the auction house because they believed there was a possibility that the seller did not have the right to sell the object at auction because it had been removed illegally from its place of origin.
The Metropolitan Police found imagery that showed the site having a large hole. It's called a looter hole. These are typical in many archaeological sites where people illegally excavate and remove items and then sell them abroad. So that hole seemed quite fresh, and it was quite large enough where the stele would have perhaps fit through. So that was submitted as key evidence that this item could have been coming out of Syria in 1999 rather than at a much earlier date.
The owner of the bottom half of the royal stele was outraged at the accusation that his treasured item was stolen, and he vowed to clear his name.
The Lebanese antiquities dealer trying to sell it says absolutely not, and I can demonstrate, going back years and years, that this has for a long time been in the possession of this person or this person, and that therefore it is being sold perfectly legally.
Despite his claims, so far the owner of the bottom of the stele hasn't been able to prove his right to sell the artifact. It remains under lock and key and in a state of limbo, a source of continuing contention for both the owner and the Metropolitan Police.
This was the first set of misfortune that he faced as a result of being in contact with this artifact. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Bernard Hogan Howe, was just due for a happy retirement, and then suddenly the collector, the owner of the lower portion, was suing him for the amount of £200,000, claiming that it was unfairly pulled from the auction and that he had lost both his artifact and also a significant amount of income that he would have expected to receive from its sale.
This has been sort of potentially associated with a curse because, of course, it's quite a large sum for someone working as a police commissioner.
So in that sense, you could argue that misfortune has befallen the people involved.
There's still a lot of controversy surrounding the Neo-Assyrian royal stele, which has caused people to question whether the curse on its inscription is manifesting itself until its safe return to its rightful owner.
In this case, I don't believe in the curse, and that's because over the years, over the decades, there have been many, many people who've come in contact both with the top half and with the lower half. And we know of one person who suffered a lot of misfortune. I'm not aware of any significant numbers of people that have faced death or accidents or illnesses.
I'm afraid I don't believe the stele is cursed, no. It's not uncommon for ancient objects to come with some sort of inscription saying, you know, don't touch, leave this alone.
I don't really believe in these kinds of curses. I can see why there's a dispute, a legal dispute, but I think the commissioner has good evidence to stand on and hopefully will be cleared.
What price can you put on ancient history? It's a brave man or woman who bids to own a piece of a lost world.